The greatest threat to this nation isn't coming from outside our borders. It's coming from a loss of confidence within them. There was a time in this country when people knew who they were. Not perfectly, not without fault, but they knew. They knew where they came from. They knew what was expected of them. They knew that freedom was not something handed down by politicians, but something earned, protected, and if necessary, bled for. Ordinary men went to work, provided for their families, kept their word, and carried a quiet pride in being part of something older and greater than themselves. Ordinary women held together the fabric of home, faith and community with a strength history rarely writes about, but civilization could never survive without. There was a moral centre, a shared story, a sense that this island, as small as it is, stood for something in the world. And then slowly, that certainty began to fade. Not in a single dramatic moment, not with tanks in the streets or flags torn down overnight, but through something far more subtle and far more effective. Shame. Shame for our history. Shame for our culture. Shame for our faith. Shame even for the idea that loving your country might be something noble rather than something dangerous. We were told that pride was arrogance, that tradition was oppression, that heritage was something to apologise for rather than something to preserve. And generation by generation, the story that once held people together was picked apart, rewritten, and in many cases simply erased. Because a nation that remembers who it is very difficult to control. But a nation that forgets can be shaped into anything. Look around today. Ask yourself a simple question. Do people feel rooted or do they feel adrift? Do young men grow up believing that they have a duty or believing that they're the problem? Do families feel supported or quietly dismantled? Do communities share common values or merely occupy the same physical space? When a people lose confidence in themselves, something very dangerous happens. They stop defending what matters. They stop passing on what is sacred. They stop believing that they're even allowed to exist as a distinct culture at all. And when that happens, decline doesn't arrive as an enemy at the gate. It arrives as confusion, as apathy, as silence. Because the greatest collapses in history were not caused by strength from the outside, but weakness from within. And this isn't about pretending that the past was perfect. It wasn't. No nation's past ever is. This is about recognising that tearing down everything that came before you leaves nothing solid to stand on. A people without memory are easy to lead. A people without pride are easy to shame. A people without faith in themselves are easy to replace, culturally, morally, and spiritually. And that is the deeper question that we have to face. Not left versus right, not party versus party, not the daily theatre of politics that keeps everyone distracted while the foundations shift. The real question is this: do we still believe this country, its history, its values and its people is worth preserving? Because if the answer to that question ever becomes no, then everything else we argue about, everything else we debate, everything else we post, everything that we do online in anger or fear, none of it matters. You cannot protect what you are ashamed of. You cannot rebuild what you refuse to name. And you cannot pass on an identity that no longer is believed to exist. So before we talk about politics, before we talk about economics, before we talk about any of the crises filling headlines, we have to go back to the beginning, to the simple, uncomfortable, unavoidable truth. If you don't know who you are, you cannot know what you're fighting to protect. And if a nation forgets the answer for that question long enough, history shows us again and again what comes next. Now, the only question for us that remains is whether we remember in time.